The crystal chandeliers of Ashford Hall glittered like frozen stars above a sea of silk and diamonds. Laughter rippled through the grand ballroom, champagne flutes clinked, and the scent of expensive perfume hung heavy in the warm air. It was the kind of night where the elite of London pretended the world outside their gilded walls did not exist. Until she stood up. Seraphine's simple gray dress looked painfully out of place among the vibrant gowns and tailored evening coats. Her hands trembled as she clutched a small bundle of letters and ledgers against her chest. For one breathless moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath as this unknown woman rose from her seat at the edge of the hall. Her voice, when it finally came, was clear and steady, cutting through the music like a blade. Your Grace?" she said, looking directly at the tall, dark-haired man standing near the marble fireplace, Quinlan Thorne, Duke of Greymont. "You have blood on your hands." A shocked murmur swept through the crowd. Fans snapped open. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Seraphine took one step forward, her hazel eyes burning with quiet fire. "2 years ago, you signed the documents that sold the orphanage on Blackthorn Lane to developers. Because of that signature, 400 children lost their home and their only chance at education. They now sleep in the alleys and work in factories before they can even read their own names. I have the letters. I have the ledgers. And I have the names of every child you helped condemn to darkness." She lifted the papers high, her voice rising with controlled fury. "These are not just numbers on paper, Your Grace. These are living souls. Children who once believed someone in power might protect them." The silence that followed was deafening. Quinlan Thorne stood frozen, his sharp jaw-tight gray eyes locked on the woman before him. His fingers tightened around the stem of his wine glass until it threatened to snap. For the first time in years, the impenetrable Duke of Greymont looked shaken because he recognized her. Seraphine, the young teacher who had written him desperate letters 2 years ago. Letters he had dismissed as the ramblings of yet another idealistic reformer. He had signed those papers under crushing pressure, tied to the debts and secrets surrounding his brother Evander's death. Secrets he had buried deep to protect what remained of the Thorne name. And now, here she was, standing in the heart of high society, daring to accuse him in front of everyone who mattered. His heart pounded violently against his ribs. A flash of memory struck him. Her handwritten plea, the neat, determined script that had haunted him for weeks before he forced himself to forget. Mrs. Eleanor Whitby, his longtime housekeeper, standing discreetly near the wall, pressed a hand to her mouth in quiet horror. Lady Beatrice Ashford, Quinlan's childhood friend, stared with wide eyes, her fan forgotten in her lap. From the corner of the room, a small group of gentlemen whispered furiously. Among them, Lucian Crane watched the scene unfold with a cold, calculating smile. Quinlan took a slow step forward, his deep voice low and dangerous, yet threaded with unmistakable tension. "Miss, whoever you are," he said carefully, "you are mistaken, and you are dangerously close to committing slander in front of half of London." Seraphine did not flinch. Though her knees felt weak and her pulse roared in her ears, she lifted her chin higher. "I am Seraphine, and I am not mistaken. I taught those children. I held them when they cried at night, because they were cold and hungry. I watched them disappear one by one after your signature took away their only shelter." She took another step closer, her voice softening with raw pain. "Do you ever think about them, Your Grace? Or do you only see columns in your account books?" The tension in the ballroom thickened until it felt suffocating. Some ladies looked away uncomfortable. Others leaned forward, hungry for scandal. Quinlan's chest rose and fell sharply. For a fleeting second, something raw flickered behind his controlled mask, guilt perhaps, or the heavy weight of choices he could never undo. He turned to two footmen standing nearby, his voice hardening like steel. "Escort this woman out. She is under arrest for public defamation." The footman moved forward. Seraphine stood perfectly still as they approached. She looked straight into Quinlan's eyes one final time, her expression calm, yet fierce tears glistening, but not falling. "You may take my freedom, Your Grace," she said clearly, her voice ringing through the stunned silence. "But you will never take the justice those children deserve." The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. As the footman took her arms, Seraphine did not resist. She walked with quiet dignity between them, head held high, while the glittering crowd parted like the Red Sea. Quinlan remained rooted in place, watching her go. His hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The letters she had left behind on the table fluttered slightly in the draft from the open doors. Outside, the night air was cold and unforgiving. Inside, the Duke of Greymont felt the first crack appear in the armor he had worn for 6 long years. And somewhere in the shadows, Lucian Crane's smile widened. This story is about the courage it takes to speak truth to power, and the unexpected healing that begins when two wounded souls are forced to truly see each other. The heavy oak doors of Greymont House closed behind Seraphine with a final, echoing thud. 2 days had passed since the scandal at Ashford Hall. Instead of a cold prison cell, she found herself standing in the grand marble entrance hall of the Duke's London residence, her small valise at her feet and her heart hammering against her ribs. Quinlan Thorne stood at the top of the sweeping staircase, his tall frame silhouetted against the morning light streaming through tall windows. His voice was quiet but left no room for argument. "You will remain here as Caspian's educational advisor. Refuse and I will ensure the charges against you are not dropped, but pursued with the full weight of my name." Seraphine lifted her chin, though her fingers twisted nervously in the folds of her worn dress. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to run. Yet the memory of those frightened children in the alleys kept her feet rooted to the floor. "Very well, Your Grace," she replied softly. "But I will teach the truth, even if it makes you uncomfortable." Quinlan's gray eyes darkened. For a moment, something vulnerable flickered across his face. A shadow of exhaustion, perhaps even fear, before the mask of icy control returned. A small boy appeared at the top of the stairs, half hidden behind the banister. Caspian Thorne, only 7 years old, watched the stranger with wide, wary eyes. His dark hair was slightly too long, and there was a hollow look in his expression that spoke of sleepless nights and unspoken grief. Seraphine's heart softened despite herself. She had seen that same lost look on the faces of the orphanage children. That afternoon in the sunlit nursery on the 2nd floor, she began her lessons. Caspian sat stiffly at the small desk, answering in short, careful sentences. But when Seraphine quietly brought in a shy 10-year-old girl named Millie the orphan she had secretly smuggled into the house under her skirts the night before, the boy's curiosity slowly broke through his silence. Millie clutched an old storybook to her chest, her thin fingers trembling. Seraphine knelt beside them both, her voice gentle as she read aloud, weaving tales of courage and second chances. Quinlan watched from the doorway, unseen. He had not expected this. He had brought Seraphine here to silence her, to keep her under his roof, where he could control the damage she might cause. Yet as the days slipped by, he found himself lingering near the nursery door, listening to her patient explanations, her soft laughter, when Caspian finally smiled at one of Millie's silly drawings. Late one evening, after the children had fallen asleep, Seraphine found Quinlan alone in his study. The fire crackled low in the hearth. Stacks of documents covered the massive mahogany desk. She hesitated at the threshold, then stepped inside. "You are not the monster I imagined," she said quietly. Quinlan looked up slowly, his fingers pausing over a yellowed letter. His shoulders were tense, as if carrying an invisible weight. "And what did you imagine, Miss Seraphine?" His voice was rough, threaded with exhaustion. A cold man who signed away children's futures without a second thought. She paused, her hazel eyes searching his face. "But I see now. You are drowning in something heavier than greed." Quinlan's jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, almost against his will, the words came. "Evander, my brother, left behind debts that threaten to destroy everything the Thorne family has built for generations. The sale of the orphanage land was meant to buy time, to protect Caspian, to keep what little remains of our name from collapsing." His voice cracked slightly on his brother's name. The pain in it was raw, unguarded. Seraphine felt her chest tighten. The anger she had carried for 2 long years began to shift slowly, transforming into something more complicated: pity, perhaps even the first fragile threads of understanding. "I lost my own family to poverty," she whispered. "I know what fear can drive a person to do. But those children, they had no one else." Quinlan met her gaze across the desk. The air between them felt suddenly charged heavy with unspoken regrets and the dangerous pull of 2 wounded souls standing too close. Days turned into weeks. Seraphine watched Quinlan with new eyes. She saw how he sat with Caspian every evening, awkward but determined, trying to reach a boy who had grown silent after losing his mother. She noticed the way his hands trembled slightly when he spoke of the past. And Quinlan, he began to question the world he had always accepted. The rigid rules of society, the quiet corruption hidden behind polite smiles and legal documents. One rainy afternoon, while sorting through old estate papers in the library, Seraphine discovered something that made her blood run cold. A letter, hidden between the pages of a ledger. It was from Mr. Hawthorne, the family's longtime solicitor. The words were carefully worded, but the meaning was unmistakable. Hawthorne had deliberately altered figures, pushed the orphanage sale forward for his own profit, and used Quinlan's signature as a shield. Seraphine's hands shook as she read the lines again. She looked up, heart pounding, just as Quinlan entered the room. Their eyes met, and in that single silent moment, the fragile trust they had begun to build trembled on the edge of something far more dangerous. This story shows us that even the most powerful among us carry hidden wounds, and that true change often begins when we dare to look beyond our anger and see the broken humanity in each other. The rain fell softly against the tall library windows of Greymont House, blurring the gas lights of London into hazy golden streaks. Inside, the fire burned low, casting long shadows across the oak-paneled walls. Seraphine and Quinlan sat on opposite sides of the long table, surrounded by scattered documents, old letters, and half-empty cups of tea that had gone cold hours ago. They had been working in silence for most of the night, a fragile secret alliance born from the letters she had found. Neither of them spoke of trust. Not yet. But the shared purpose had begun to pull them closer, like 2 ships drawn together in a quiet storm. Quinlan rubbed his temple, his voice low and weary. Hawthorne was careful. Too careful. Every signature, every clause, it all points back to me. Seraphine looked up from the ledger, her hazel eyes soft, with something new, not anger, but quiet understanding. "Because you trusted him," she said gently, "just as those children once trusted the system that failed them. He met her gaze across the table. For a moment, the mask slipped. She saw the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, the weight of 6 years of carrying secrets alone. Later that week, in the bright nursery filled with morning light, Quinlan stood quietly by the door and watched. Seraphine sat on the floor with Caspian and Millie, her simple dress pooled around her like gray petals. She was teaching them how to face fear not with harsh words or rigid rules, but with small, brave steps. When the dark feels too big, she told them softly, you don't have to fight it all at once. You only need to light one small candle. Caspian, who had barely spoken above a whisper since his mother's death, reached out and took Millie's hand. The little girl smiled shyly. For the first time in months, the boy's shoulders relaxed. Quinlan felt something twist sharply in his chest. He had raised his son with discipline and distance, believing it would make him strong. But watching Seraphine now, he realized the boy needed warmth more than walls. He needed exactly what Quinlan himself had been starving for: gentle hands and patient hearts. That same night, long after the children were asleep, Seraphine found Quinlan standing alone on the dimly lit balcony overlooking the garden. The cool night air carried the faint scent of wet stone and roses. She approached slowly, hesitating at the threshold. "You were watching us today," she said. Quinlan didn't turn around at first. When he did, his gray eyes held a storm of conflicting emotions. "I've spent years believing control was the only way to protect what I love," he admitted, his voice rough with vulnerability. "But seeing you with Caspian, with Millie, I wonder if I've only been building bigger cages." Seraphine stepped closer. The moonlight touched her dark hair, softening the determined lines of her face. "We all carry losses, Your Grace. I lost my parents to fever when I was barely older than Millie. You lost your brother. We cannot change the past, but we can choose not to let it poison the future." Their conversation stretched deep into the night, whispered words about grief, duty, and the burning desire to build something better than the world they had inherited. Each shared truth drew them closer until the space between them felt dangerously small, charged with unspoken longing. But danger was already circling. One gray afternoon, Lucian Crane arrived unannounced. He strode into the drawing room with the confidence of a man who believed the world owed him everything. Tall, sharply dressed, with cold blue eyes that reminded Seraphine too much of the alleys she had escaped. "So this is where you've been hiding, cousin," he said smoothly, his gaze sliding over Seraphine with thinly veiled contempt. Playing governess to the Duke's bastard whelp while pretending to be a saint. Quinlan stepped forward, his voice dangerously quiet. "Choose your words carefully, Crane." Lucian smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I have influence in certain circles, Thorne. Enough to make sure everyone knows this woman is nothing but a clever opportunist trying to blackmail a grieving duke. And as her closest male relative, I have every right to demand she return to the family fold, along with any benefits she may have gained here." Seraphine's hands clenched at her sides. Fear coiled tight in her stomach, but she refused to look away. Lady Beatrice Ashford, who had come for tea, rose gracefully from her seat. "Careful, Lucian," she warned, her voice cool and steady. "Threats have a way of revealing more about the accuser than the accused." Dr. Elias Rowan, and the young progressive physician who had been quietly supporting Seraphine's work with the children, stood beside her. "And the truth has a way of coming to light," he added firmly, "especially when good people refuse to stay silent." The tension in the room thickened until it felt like glass about to shatter. That night, Quinlan paced his study like a caged lion, He stood at the window, staring into the darkness, torn between the legacy his father and Evander had left behind, and the woman who had begun to awaken something long buried in his heart. Protecting Seraphine could cost him everything: his reputation, his remaining fortune, the fragile future he was trying to rebuild for Caspian. Seraphine found him there, her footsteps soft on the carpet. "You don't have to choose between your name and doing what's right," she whispered. Quinlan turned to her, his expression raw with conflict. "What if choosing you means losing the last pieces of who I was supposed to be?" Before she could answer, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Mrs. Eleanor Whitby appeared in the doorway, her usually calm face pale with alarm. "Your Grace." "The documents we were keeping in the safe, the original letters and ledgers proving Hawthorne's manipulation, they're gone." The silence that followed was devastating. Seraphine felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Quinlan's face drained of color. Someone had stolen their most important evidence. And now, with Lucian Crane's threats hanging over them like a blade, they stood on the edge of losing everything they had begun to build together. This story reminds us that real courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to reach for someone's hand, even when the ground beneath you is crumbling. The Grand Council chamber of the House of Lords felt colder than the autumn wind howling outside. Heavy velvet drapes framed tall windows, and the long mahogany table gleamed under the light of dozens of candles. Quinlan Thorne stood at the head of the room, his shoulders squared, his face carved from stone. Every peer present watched him with sharp, calculating eyes. He had not slept in 2 days. With the most damning evidence stolen, there was only one path left, a path that would cost him dearly. Quinlan's voice rang out, steady but heavy with finality. "I hereby relinquish control of the northern estates and the mining rights attached to them. The proceeds will be used to establish a permanent trust, the Evander Thorne Educational Fund, for orphaned children across London." A stunned silence fell over the chamber. Then came the murmurs. Sharp, disapproving, furious. "You cannot be serious, Thorne," one older lord barked. "That land has been in your family for 4 generations. Quinlan did not flinch. "I am deadly serious. In exchange, all charges against Miss Seraphine will be dropped immediately. And any further interference with the orphanage matter will be met with my full opposition." Lady Beatrice Ashford, seated among the observers, rose halfway from her chair, her face pale with disbelief. "Quinlan," she whispered urgently when she caught him alone in the corridor afterward, "think of what you're doing. The Thorne name your son's future, everything your father and Evander fought to protect. It's slipping away." Quinlan looked at his oldest friend, exhaustion and sorrow etched deep into his features. "I've spent 6 years protecting a name built on silence and fear," he said quietly. "Perhaps it's time I protected something that actually matters." Back at Greymont House that evening, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Seraphine stood in the doorway of the study, watching Quinlan as he stared into the dying fire. His usually impeccable coat was discarded, his cravat loosened, dark hair falling across his forehead. He looked broken, human in a way she had never seen before. She stepped inside slowly, her heart aching with emotions she could no longer deny. "You gave up so much," she whispered, voice trembling. "For children you barely knew. For me, when I once stood in a ballroom and called you a monster." Quinlan turned to her. His gray eyes were raw and guarded, carrying the weight of every sacrifice he had just made. "I watched you with Caspian and Millie," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "You taught them hope when I had none left to give. You reminded me that strength isn't in holding power. It's in knowing when to let it go." Seraphine felt tears sting her eyes. The walls she had built around her heart, built from 2 years of anger and pain, began to crumble. She crossed the room and stopped just inches from him. "I was so certain you were cold," she admitted softly. "But the man who would burn his own legacy to protect the innocent, that man is someone I could—" Her words trailed off, too fragile to finish. In the nursery upstairs, Caspian and Millie had crept to the top of the stairs, listening. When Quinlan later sat with them by the hearth, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, Caspian hesitated for a long moment. Then the little boy climbed into his lap, something he had never done before. "Papa?" Caspian whispered, his small voice cracking with emotion. "Are you going to be all right?" Quinlan froze. The word Papa hit him like a gentle blow to the chest. His arms slowly wrapped around the boy, holding him close as tears he had held back for years finally threatened to fall. Millie reached out and placed her small hand over his. "You're not alone anymore," she said simply. The moment was tender, fragile, healing. But the storm was not over. The next morning, Lucian Crane burst into the house without announcement, his face twisted with triumph and malice. He found Quinlan and Seraphine in the drawing room. "I warned you both," Lucian sneered, holding up a sealed envelope. "I have letters, confessions, proof of exactly how your precious brother Evander really died that night 6 years ago, Thorne. One word from me, and the scandal will destroy what little is left of your name." Quinlan's face drained of color. The old wound, the guilt, the shame, the secret he had carried like chains ripped open once more. Seraphine stepped forward, instinctively placing herself between Quinlan and Lucia, her hands clenched into fists, even as fear coursed through her veins. "You would destroy a man for refusing to let you steal from children," she demanded, voice shaking with fury and terror. Lucian laughed coldly. "I would destroy him for standing in the way of what is rightfully mine." The air grew thick with dread. Quinlan stood motionless, torn between the desperate need to protect his family's remaining honor and the growing certainty that protecting Seraphine and the children mattered more than any legacy. Seraphine turned to him then. Without hesitation, she reached out and took his hand in both of hers, her touch warm and steady despite the trembling in her fingers. She looked into his eyes, her voice soft but unwavering. "If you lose everything, Quinlan, I will still be here." Her words hung between them like a promise and a prayer. In that single touch, in that quiet declaration, something profound shifted. The Duke of Greymont, who had once believed power was his only shield, felt the first true crack of light break through years of darkness. And the woman who had once accused him before all of London now stood ready to stand beside him through the fire. This story teaches us that the deepest sacrifices are not made for glory, but for love. And that sometimes losing everything is the only way to finally find yourself. The courtroom was hushed heavy with anticipation. Sunlight filtered through tall, arched windows, casting long golden beams across the polished wooden floors. Every seat was filled lords, ladies, journalists, and ordinary citizens who had come to witness the fall of a duke. Or perhaps something greater. Lucian Crane stood confidently at the center, a smug smile playing on his lips as he prepared to deliver his final blow. The sealed envelope containing his accusations against the Thorne family rested on the table before him. Then, Mrs. Eleanor Whitby stepped forward. The longtime housekeeper of Greymont House walked slowly to the witness stand, her back straight despite her age, her hands clasped tightly to hide their trembling. She had served the Thorne family for over 30 years. Today she would serve the truth, with quiet dignity, She produced a small bundle of letters, tied with faded ribbon documents she'd kept hidden in the lining of an old trunk for 6 long years. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, but laced with sorrow, "these letters prove that Mr. Lucien Crane was the one who approached Mr. Hawthorne with the scheme to falsify documents and profit from the orphanage sale. He used the Duke's grief over his brother's death to manipulate him. The children were never meant to be protected, only exploited." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Lucian's face turned ashen. His carefully constructed mask shattered in an instant. "You old fool," he hissed. "You have no proof I have kept every letter." Mrs. Whitby interrupted gently, her eyes meeting Quinlan's for a brief moment. "Because I loved this family enough to protect its soul, even when it meant waiting for the right time." Seraphine was called next. She rose from her seat, her simple dress a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. Her hands shook slightly as she approached the stand, but when she spoke, her voice carried the quiet strength of someone who had nothing left to lose. "I do not stand here as a victim," she said clearly, looking straight at the judge and then across the room. "I stand here as a witness to injustice. These children deserved safety, education, and hope. If speaking the truth makes me an enemy of the powerful, then I accept that title with pride." Her words moved through the courtroom like a wave. Several ladies dabbed at their eyes. Even hardened reporters lowered their pens, listening. Quinlan watched her from his seat, his chest tight with emotions he could no longer contain. When it was his turn to speak, he stood slowly, every movement weighed down by years of guilt. He looked at the crowded room, then at Seraphine, and finally at the portrait of his late brother Evander that seemed to watch over them all. "I failed my brother," he said, his voice rough with raw honesty. 6 years ago, in my desperation to protect our family's name, I made choices that caused suffering. I signed documents I should have questioned. I turned away from those who needed help because I was drowning in my own grief and fear. Today I ask not for forgiveness from this court, but from myself and from those I have hurt." His eyes found Seraphine's across the room. In that shared look past years of pain, understanding, and the fragile beginning of healing. The verdict came swiftly. Lucien Crane was charged with fraud and conspiracy. The Thorne name, though scarred, remained intact, not because of power, but because of truth. Weeks later, on a crisp spring morning, Greymont House looked entirely different. The grand ballroom had been transformed. Sunlight poured through freshly cleaned windows onto rows of small desks and shelves filled with books. Laughter echoed where once there had only been silence. The house was no longer just a residence. It had become a school and safe haven for dozens of orphaned children. In the garden beneath a simple white arch, adorned with wild roses, Quinlan Thorne stood waiting. He wore a dark coat, no elaborate decorations, just a single white rose pinned to his lapel. His gray eyes softened the moment he saw her. Seraphine walked toward him on a path scattered with petals, her dress simple ivory silk that caught the gentle breeze. She carried no veil, only a small bouquet of lavender and white roses. Her hazel eyes shone with quiet joy and deep certainty. Caspian and Millie stood beside them, both dressed in their finest clothes, holding hands, and smiling with pure, unfiltered happiness. They looked like the children they truly were, safe, loved, and full of hope. Dr. Elias Rowan stood among the small gathering of witnesses, nodding with quiet approval as he thought of the new educational programs they would soon expand together. When the simple vows were spoken and the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Quinlan took Seraphine's hands in his. He leaned down, resting his forehead gently against hers for a moment, breathing her in. "I once believed power was everything," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But today I know that family and justice are the only legacy that truly matters." Seraphine smiled through happy tears, her fingers tightening around his. "And I once believed love was a luxury I could not afford," she replied softly. "You taught me it is the bravest thing we can choose." They kissed, slow, tender, and full of promise, as Caspian and Millie clapped with delight and the small crowd cheered warmly. Later, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds, Quinlan stood with Seraphine on the terrace overlooking the garden. Children's laughter floated up from below. The house behind them felt alive, warm, and full of possibility. Mrs. Eleanor Whitby watched from a distance, a peaceful smile on her face. Lady Beatrice raised a glass in quiet toast. Dr. Rowan spoke animatedly with a group of new teachers about future plans. Quinlan pulled Seraphine closer, wrapping his arms around her waist. "We lost much," he murmured against her hair. "But we gained everything that matters." Seraphine rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Yes," she whispered. "And we will keep building. Together." This story shows us that true justice often comes from the courage of ordinary people. That love has the power to heal even the deepest family wounds, and that the most meaningful new beginnings are born not from victory or wealth, but from honest sacrifice and unwavering hope. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. We appreciate you more than you think. If this tale stirred something deep inside, we invite you to remain part of this frontier of memories. More true stories of honor, compassion, and destiny are waiting for you here. Subscribe, share, comment, and thank you for riding with us today. Aviso legal barra disclaimer. Our content is designed for artistic and entertainment purposes and may reinterpret historical themes using fictional touches. We apply AI tools thoughtfully only to support production, while keeping human supervision over editing, emotional tone, and narrative coherence. We always comply with regulatory guidelines for AI-based media and avoid deepfake practices or identity manipulation. All supporting components remain legally sourced. Please ask for authorization before sharing or adapting any segment. Your respect makes it possible for us to continue telling meaningful stories.